The wind in Wyoming that winter wasn't just wind. It was a predator stalking the high plains, and the Caldwell cabin was its prey. The little homestead stood shivering at the edge of the woods, its timbers groaning like an old man's bones. Inside, Sarah Caldwell coaxed the last few splinters of wood to life in the iron stove. The flame was weak, a tiny orange ghost that did little to fight the shadows clinging to the bare floorboards and the worn-out quilts. It was a losing battle, and she knew it. Her son, Thomas, who was only 10 but had the eyes of someone much older, sat at the table. He was sharpening a pencil stub, the same one he used for every lesson, the scraping sound lost in the howl of the storm outside. On a small cot in the corner, his little sister Lily was curled up with a one-eyed rag doll. She hummed a melody so quiet it was more of a feeling than a sound, a tiny pocket of warmth in a world of biting cold. Sarah moved through the room with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had forgotten what it felt like to rest. Her arms were thin, her face was tired, but beneath it all was a strength that didn't need to be loud. It was just there, settled deep in her soul. She pressed her hand against the icy window pane, the frost so thick it looked like a frozen lung. She whispered to the glass, to the storm, to herself. "This cold'll take us," she breathed, the words turning to mist. "It'll take us all if we don't make it through the week." No one heard her, or so she thought. A moment later, a voice cut through the wind's cry, sharp and terrified. "Mama, come quick!" Thomas was at the door, his face flushed, his eyes wide with a strange mix of fear and awe. "There's a man in the snow." Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed her shawl as Thomas held the door open, letting in a furious blast of wind that tasted like ice and death. She stepped out into the white chaos, the snow crunching under her worn leather boots. The blizzard had eased just enough to see, and what she saw made her blood run cold. There, half swallowed by a snowdrift near the woodpile, was a figure. A man, completely still, his coat frozen solid. His breath came in shallow, ghostly puffs. Even half dead and bleeding, he looked like he'd fallen from another world. His boots were fine leather, his coat made of dark wool with buttons that glinted like silver coins. He reeked of money, even as he lay dying in her yard. Lily was in the doorway now, her small hands clutching the frame. "We can't just leave him, Mama," she pleaded, her voice trembling. Sarah paused, just for a heartbeat, just long enough for the cold to sink its teeth into her. This man was trouble. She could feel it. But then she saw the dark stain spreading across his side, melting the snow beneath him into a grim pink slush. He wasn't just freezing. He was shot. She moved forward, her decision made. She knelt and rolled the man over. A nasty gash was carved across his temple, but the wound in his side was worse, a dark, weeping hole. "Thomas," she said, her voice firm, "get the fire roaring! Open the door!" Together they dragged the stranger inside, his heavy, expensive boots scuffing a trail through the snow on her floor. He groaned, a sound torn from deep inside him, a sound of pure agony. They laid him on her own cot, his body shaking uncontrollably. She didn't have much, but she tore strips from an old nightgown and packed the gunshot wound, her hands moving with a grim purpose. She boiled the last of her willow bark for the pain and pressed a damp cloth to his feverish head. He didn't speak. He just shivered. That night, Sarah didn't sleep. She sat in her rocking chair by the fire, her late husband's rifle laid across her lap, and watched the stranger breathe. She didn't know his name or his story, but she knew one thing for certain. The storm wasn't over. It had just found its way inside her house. The next morning, the wind had died, but the silence inside the cabin was heavier than any storm. The stranger was still unconscious, his breathing ragged, his jaw locked tight. The fever had taken hold, drenching him in sweat that soaked the thin blanket Thomas had given up from his own bed. Sarah was a ghost moving between the stove and the cot, her face a mask of grim determination. She bathed his face with a cloth soaked in yarrow, whispering to him, or maybe to herself. "Just keep breathing," she muttered. "That's all you have to do now." She'd learned a long time ago not to pray for miracles, but her hands worked as if they still believed in them, cleaning the wound, forcing sips of broth between his cracked lips. Around noon, he stirred. His fingers twitched, then his eyelids fluttered open. They were a pale, washed-out blue, clouded with pain and confusion. He stared at the log ceiling, then his eyes drifted and found her leaning over him. "Water," he rasped, his voice like sandpaper. She held a tin cup to his lips and he drank, slowly, carefully. "You got a name?" she asked, her tone flat. His mouth worked, but no sound came out. She waited, patient as a stone. Finally, he managed one word. "Jack." She studied his face, the fine lines around his eyes, the hard set of his jaw. "Is that the truth?" she asked. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shrug, and she knew it was a lie. Still, it was something. "I'm Sarah Caldwell," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "This is my house, those are my children, and you're bleeding on my cot." Jack didn't reply. "I don't make a habit of taking in strays," she went on. "But you were dying, and my daughter has a softer heart than I do." In the corner, Lily watched them, her rag doll held tight to her chest. Jack finally closed his eyes. "Didn't mean to bring you trouble," he whispered. "You didn't," Sarah said, her voice low and certain. "But I have a feeling it's not far behind you." That night, the fever dreams came. Jack thrashed on the cot, his body rigid, muttering names that meant nothing to her. "Barlow," he'd cry out. "Isabel. The Southern Range." But then he said another name, a name that made the air in the room go still and cold. He said, "Daniel." Sarah froze, the cloth in her hand falling to the floor. Daniel. Her husband's name. How could this stranger, this Jack, know her dead husband's name? Her mind raced. It had to be a coincidence. It had to be. But the way he said it, filled with a grief and anger that mirrored her own, felt too real. She pushed the thought away, telling herself it was just the fever talking, just random words pulled from a dying man's mind. She sat with him until dawn, pressing a cool hand to his forehead when he cried out, her own heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She was no longer just tending to a stranger. She was tending to a ghost from her past, and she had no idea if he was here to save her or destroy her. The fever broke on the third day. Jack woke up weak and disoriented, but the fire in his skin had cooled. He spent another day drifting in and out of sleep, and by the fourth he was able to stand, leaning heavily on the wall, a quilt wrapped around his shoulders. Thomas stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching him with open suspicion. The boy hadn't said a word to Jack, but his eyes followed his every move. Jack noticed. He looked at Thomas, a flicker of understanding in his pale blue eyes. "You don't trust me," he said. It wasn't a question. Thomas just stared back, his jaw set. Jack gave a slow nod. "That's good," he said, his voice still rough. "A boy your age should be careful." Later that day, Sarah was sorting through the stranger's ruined clothes before burning them. She needed the space, and she didn't want any reminders of the violence that had brought him here. His fine wool coat was torn and stained with blood. As she reached into an inner pocket to make sure it was empty, her fingers brushed against something small and hard. She pulled it out. It was a small wooden bird, carved from a piece of pine, its wings half spread as if in mid-flight. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was identical, absolutely identical to the one her Daniel had carved for Lily just before he died. The same smooth lines, the same tiny detailed feathers. Her mind refused to accept it. She ran to Lily's cot and found the doll. Tucked into its cloth belt was the other bird. She held them side by side in her trembling palm. They were a perfect pair. 1,000 questions exploded in her mind. Who was this man? How did he have this? Was he a thief? Did he know Daniel? Was he there when he died? The fever dream, the name. It wasn't a coincidence. This man, Jack, was tied to her husband, and that meant he was tied to the secret she'd been keeping from her own children for 2 long years. The official story was that Daniel had caught a fever while working a claim up north. The truth was far darker. Daniel had been murdered. And now, the man lying on her cot held a piece of that dark truth in his pocket. The air in the cabin suddenly felt thick, suffocating. She looked at Jack, who was watching her from the cot, his expression unreadable. The trouble she'd feared wasn't following him. It had been living in her house all along. Sarah tucked the wooden bird into her apron pocket, her hand shaking so badly she could barely close her fingers around it. She needed to think. She needed to understand. But one look at Jack's guarded eyes told her that answers wouldn't come easily. For the next few days, an uneasy truce settled over the cabin. Jack, against her protests, started to move. He was slow, his hand often pressed to his bandaged side, but he was driven by a restless energy. He fixed the broken rail on the fence Thomas had been struggling with for a week, his swings of the hammer deliberate and sure. He mended a loose board on the porch, his movements precise, economical. This was not the work of a simple drifter. This was the work of a man who knew how to build, how to create. Just like Daniel. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Thomas watched him, his suspicion warring with a grudging respect. Jack showed him how to set a proper snare, not with words, but with quiet, patient actions. That evening, they ate rabbit stew, the first real meat they'd had in a month. At the small table, the silence was thick with unspoken questions. Lily, innocent to the tension, chattered away to Jack about her doll, telling him how brave she was. Jack listened, a faint, sad smile touching his eyes. He seemed to carry a world of sorrow within him, and Sarah found herself wondering what he had lost. Or who. After the children were asleep, she found the courage. She sat across from him by the dying fire, the 2 wooden birds resting on the small table between them like a silent accusation. Jack didn't look at them. He was sharpening a small knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filling the room. "I haven't had a man in this house since Daniel died," she said, her voice steady. Jack's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their work. "He was a good man," she continued, looking into the flames. "Strong hands, quiet eyes. He built this place from the ground up. I told the children a fever took him." She paused, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "The truth is, something else took him. Something violent." Jack finally looked up from the knife. His pale eyes met hers across the firelight, and she saw a flicker of the same grief she felt every single day. "I know," he said softly. Her heart skipped a beat. "How?" she whispered. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out another small object. It wasn't a bird. It was a worn, silver locket. He opened it. Inside was a tiny, faded portrait of a young woman with dark, laughing eyes. "Her name was Isabel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She was my sister. Barlow took her from me." He closed the locket with a snap. "The same man who took your Daniel. The name from the fever dream. Barlow." It all clicked into place, a horrifying, sickening puzzle. "You were partners?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "All 3 of you?" Jack nodded slowly. "We found a claim up on the southern range, gold, enough to make us all kings." But Barlow wasn't the sharing type. He wanted it all. He stared into the fire, his face a mask of old pain. "He staged a cave-in. I was lucky to get out. Daniel wasn't." He paused. "I thought he was dead. I swear to you, Sarah, I thought he was gone. I spent 2 years hunting Barlow, trying to find a way to get my sister back. Then a month ago, I heard a rumor. A man matching Daniel's description had been seen near Cheyenne buying supplies." "He survived," Sarah breathed, the words catching in her throat. A wild, impossible hope flared in her chest. "He survived the cave-in?" Jack's expression turned grim. "He did. But Barlow's men found him before I could. They shot him. I found him by the river dying." He finally looked at the wooden birds on the table. "He made me promise. He gave me one of the birds and told me about the other. He said, 'Find my Sarah, protect her, the map is with her.' Then he died in my arms." Sarah felt the floor drop out from beneath her. A map? Daniel had survived only to be murdered, and this whole time this stranger, Jack, had known. He had carried her husband's last words, her husband's last gift, and he hadn't told her. The fragile trust she had started to feel shattered into a million pieces. She wasn't looking at a fellow victim. She was looking at a man who had let her believe a lie. "Why didn't you tell me?" she demanded, her voice rising with a mix of fury and grief. "Why did you let me sit here day after day not knowing?" Jack looked at her, his own pain raw and exposed. "Because Barlow thinks I'm dead too," he said. "And his men are looking for that map. I brought that danger right to your door." Just then, a floorboard creaked in the corner. Thomas stood in the shadows, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. He had heard everything. Thomas didn't say a word. He just stared, first at Jack, then at his mother, a look of profound betrayal on his young face. Then he turned and fled to the small loft where he slept, pulling the ladder up behind him. Sarah felt her heart break all over again. She had protected him from the truth for 2 years, and now it had been ripped open by a stranger. She turned back to Jack, her anger replaced by a cold dread. "A map," she repeated, her voice hollow. "What map?" Jack leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "The deed to the claim, Sarah. It's not just a piece of paper. Daniel encoded its location, the exact coordinates, into a map. He told me he left it somewhere safe here, somewhere only you would find. Barlow knows it exists. He knows it's the only legal proof of ownership. Without it, he's just a claim jumper. With it, he's the richest man in Wyoming." The room felt small, the walls closing in. The cozy cabin Daniel had built for her was no longer a sanctuary. It was a treasure chest, and the wolves were circling. "So you came here for the map," she said, the accusation clear in her voice. "Not for us." Jack's face hardened. "I came here to honor a dying man's last wish," he corrected her. "I came to protect his family and to see that his legacy wasn't stolen. Daniel saved my life in that cave-in. He pushed me out of the way, just as the timbers gave. I owe him this. I owe you this." His sincerity was disarming, but she couldn't let go of the sting of his deception. "And what about your sister? Isabel?" she asked. "Barlow has her," he said, the words heavy with guilt. "He's using her to keep me in line. He thinks I'm the only one who knows Daniel had a partner. He doesn't know about you. Or at least he didn't." The implication hung in the air between them. By coming here, Jack had painted a target on all their backs. The quiet life she had fought so hard to maintain was over. The next few days were a quiet agony. Thomas refused to speak to either of them, communicating only with Lily, his eyes filled with a simmering resentment. Jack worked tirelessly outside, splitting wood, patching the coop, as if physical labor could atone for the secrets he'd kept. Sarah felt like a ghost in her own home, trapped between her son's anger and the stranger's dangerous truth. She searched the cabin, her hands tracing every line of the furniture Daniel had built, every loose floorboard, every jar in the pantry. Where would he hide something so important? Where was the one place only she would look? The answer came to her one morning as she was making her bed, the bed she had once shared with Daniel. Her hands smoothed over the heavy oak headboard, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns he had carved into the wood. He had spent months on it, calling it his masterpiece. It was a swirling design of leaves and vines, but as her fingers moved over the familiar shapes, she felt it. A slight indentation that wasn't part of the pattern, a seam so faint it was almost invisible. With trembling hands, she pressed on it. A small hidden compartment clicked open. Inside, nestled in a hollowed-out space, was a tightly rolled piece of oilcloth. The map. It had been right there, inches from her head, every single night for 2 years. Just as she unrolled it, she heard it. A sharp, commanding knock at the door, not a neighborly rap. This was the knock of someone who wasn't asking for permission. Her blood ran cold. They were here. Sarah quickly shoved the map back into the headboard and clicked the compartment shut. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She took a deep breath, schooling her features into a neutral mask, and walked to the door. Jack was already there, having come in from the yard, his body tense, his hand resting casually on the wood axe he'd been using. He stood just behind the door, out of sight. Sarah opened it a crack. Standing on her porch was Mr. Silas Croft, the banker from town. He was dressed in his usual city finery, his wool coat and clean boots a stark contrast to the muddy yard, but he wasn't alone. Behind him, on horseback, sat a man with a sneer and dead, empty eyes. "Mrs. Caldwell," Croft said, tipping his hat with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "A pleasure as always." "Croft," she replied, her voice flat. She didn't open the door any wider. His gaze flickered past her, trying to peer into the cabin. "I'm just making my rounds," he said smoothly. "And I heard a rumor I found rather concerning. Heard you'd taken in a stray. A man fitting the description of a known outlaw, Elias Vance." Thomas, who had crept down from the loft, froze on the stairs. He had found a tattered wanted poster for Elias Vance in Jack's coat pocket days ago and had hidden it, unsure of what it meant. Now, hearing the name spoken aloud, his eyes shot to Jack, who remained hidden behind the door. Was Jack the outlaw? "I don't know anyone by that name," Sarah said, her voice like ice. Croft's smile widened. "Perhaps not. But my associate here, Mr. Shank, is an agent of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. He's been tracking Vance for months. Believes he may have come this way." The man named Shank stared at her, his expression bored and menacing at the same time. "The man we're looking for is a killer and a thief," Shank said, his voice a low growl. "He was last seen with a man named Daniel Caldwell." Sarah felt the world tilt. They were twisting the story, painting Daniel as a criminal. "My husband is dead," she said, forcing the words out. "That's not what we hear," Croft said, his polite facade beginning to crumble. "We hear he and Vance stole something very valuable from my client, Mr. Barlow. A deed to a mineral claim." It was a trap. They were trying to frighten her, to make her give up the map without a fight. Behind the door, Jack shifted his weight. He knew this was a lie. Elias Vance was his brother. Barlow had murdered him years ago and was now using his name to hunt Jack down. "Your payments are overdue, Mrs. Caldwell," Croft continued, his voice turning hard. "Ordinarily, I could grant an extension, but harboring a fugitive, well, that complicates things. The bank can't be seen associating with criminals." He was giving her an ultimatum: turn over the map, or he would foreclose and have Shank arrest Jack. And maybe her too. "You have until sundown," Croft said. "Give Mr. Shank the deed and your debt is cleared. If not—" He let the threat hang in the air. He tipped his hat again, a gesture of pure mockery, and turned to leave. As he mounted his horse, he looked back at her. "Your husband chose his partners poorly, Mrs. Caldwell. I suggest you don't make the same mistake." They rode off, leaving a suffocating silence behind them. The door clicked shut. Jack stepped out from behind it, his face grim, the wood axe held tight in his hand. Thomas was still on the stairs, his face pale, clutching the hidden wanted poster in his pocket. The house was no longer a sanctuary, it was a cage, and the hunters were closing in. "He's lying," Jack said, his voice a low growl. "Elias was my brother. Barlow killed him 5 years ago, same way he killed Daniel. He's using my brother's name to frame me." Sarah looked at him, then at Thomas, who was still frozen on the stairs. Her son's face was a mixture of fear and confusion. He didn't know who to believe. "The map," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's in the headboard." Jack's eyes widened slightly. "Daniel, you clever son of a—" He cut himself off. "We can't let them get it." "What do we do?" Sarah asked, the weight of their situation pressing down on her. "We can't fight them." "You're right," Jack said, a strange, cold calm settling over him. "We don't fight them. We outsmart them." He moved quickly, his mind already working. "Thomas," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I need your help. I need you to trust me, just for a few hours." Thomas hesitated, his eyes darting from Jack to his mother. He looked down at the crumpled wanted poster in his hand, then back at Jack's determined face. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. "Good," Jack said. "Here's what we're going to do." For the next hour, they worked. Jack had Sarah retrieve the map. He studied it for a moment, then, using a piece of charcoal from the stove, he began to meticulously copy it onto a piece of old parchment Sarah had, but he made small, crucial changes. A landmark shifted, a creek bend altered, a ridge line moved just slightly to the north. It was a brilliant forgery, close enough to fool a man who had never seen the real terrain, but wrong enough to lead him on a wild goose chase deep into the unforgiving wilderness. "What good will this do?" Sarah asked as he rolled up the fake map. "They'll just come back when they realize it's a fake." "They won't have time," Jack said, his eyes glinting. "By the time they figure it out, we'll be long gone." "Gone?" Sarah stared at him. "Gone where? This is our home." "It's not a home anymore, Sarah. It's a target. We'll take what we need and head for Cheyenne. I have associates there. People who can help us fight Barlow legally." He handed the real map to Thomas. "Hide this," he commanded. "Don't let it out of your sight." Thomas took the oilcloth, his young face set with a new, grave responsibility. He disappeared into the loft. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows across the yard, they saw them returning. Croft and Shank, plus 2 more men, both carrying rifles. They weren't coming to negotiate. Jack met Sarah's eyes. "When I give the signal, you and the children run for the barn. Get the horses ready. Don't wait for me." "I won't leave you," she said, her hand instinctively going to the rifle by the door. "You have to," he insisted. "You have to get the children and that map to safety. It's the only way Daniel's death means something. It's the only way we win." He tucked the forged map into his belt and stepped out onto the porch, unarmed, his hands held up in a gesture of surrender. "I was hoping you'd see reason," Croft said with a smug grin as he dismounted. Shank and his men fanned out, their rifles trained on Jack. "The deed," Shank growled. Jack slowly pulled the forged map from his belt and tossed it onto the ground in front of them. "Take it," he said. "It's what you wanted." Croft picked it up, unrolling it with greedy fingers. He squinted at the markings in the fading light. "It looks right," he said to Shank. Shank grunted, never taking his eyes off Jack. "Now about the foreclosure," Jack began. "The foreclosure stands," Croft sneered. "And Mr. Vance here is coming with us. There's still the matter of that murder warrant." It was a double cross. They were never going to let them go, but Jack had been expecting it. "I don't think so," he said calmly. Then he whistled, a single sharp, piercing note. From the barn, a lantern suddenly crashed through the hayloft window, shattering on the ground and erupting into a wall of flame. It was the signal. Sarah, who had slipped out the back moments before, had created the diversion. As Croft and his men whirled around in shock, distracted by the sudden blaze, Jack lunged. He didn't go for a gun. He went for the horses, slapping the rump of Croft's terrified mount. The horse reared, screaming, and bolted straight into the other men. Chaos erupted. "Get the kids, go!" Jack yelled as he tackled Shank, sending them both tumbling into the mud. Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed Lily and sprinted for the back of the barn, where Thomas was already leading out their 2 old farm horses. Gunshots rang out behind them. Sarah threw Lily onto one horse and scrambled up behind her, Thomas leaping onto the other. She risked a glance back. The barn was now fully engulfed in flames, a roaring funeral pyre lighting up the night sky. In the hellish orange light, she saw Jack fighting with a ferocity she couldn't have imagined, using the chaos to his advantage. He brought one of the hired guns down with a brutal blow from a discarded fence post. But he was outnumbered. As they galloped away into the darkness, the last thing she saw was Shank recovering, raising his rifle, and taking aim squarely at Jack's back. A gunshot echoed across the valley. They rode hard, the crack of the gunshot echoing in Sarah's ears. She didn't dare look back. She just spurred her horse on, Lily clinging to her waist, her small body trembling. Thomas rode beside them, his face a grim mask in the moonlight, the precious map tucked safely inside his shirt. They rode for hours, pushing the horses until their sides were heaving, not stopping until the faint glow of the burning barn was long gone, swallowed by the dark, empty plains. They finally took shelter in a small, rocky canyon as the first hint of dawn touched the sky. Sarah slid from the horse, her body aching, her mind numb with fear and grief. Had Jack survived? The gunshot. She couldn't shake the image of Shank taking aim. "Is he?" Thomas started, his voice cracking. "I don't know," Sarah answered honestly, her voice raw. "I don't know." They were alone, fugitives. Their home was gone, likely reduced to a pile of smoldering ash. All they had were the clothes on their backs, 2 tired horses, and a map that had cost them everything. As the sun rose higher, Sarah took stock of their situation. Cheyenne was at least a 3-day ride, and they had no food, no water, and no weapons besides an old hunting knife. And Croft's men would be hunting them. They would have discovered the map was a fake by now, and their fury would be boundless. Lily, exhausted and terrified, had cried herself to sleep. Thomas sat apart, staring at the horizon, his hand resting on the lump in his shirt, where the map was hidden. He looked up at his mother, his young eyes filled with a terrible weight. "This is my fault," he whispered. "I found that wanted poster. I thought he was a bad man." "No, Thomas," Sarah said, pulling him close. "This isn't your fault. This is about greed. And this is about finishing what your father started." She looked at the map, which Thomas had pulled out. It was more than just a path to gold. It was a path to justice. It was their only hope. They spent the day resting the horses and hiding from sight. As dusk fell, they prepared to move again, traveling under the cover of darkness. As Sarah was checking the saddle on her horse, she heard a faint sound, a whistle, the same sharp, piercing note Jack had used as a signal. Her head snapped up. Thomas heard it too, his eyes wide. They scanned the ridge above them. And then they saw him, a lone figure on horseback, silhouetted against the deep purple sky. It was Jack. He was alive. Relief washed over Sarah so powerfully her knees almost buckled. But as he rode closer, she saw that he wasn't unscathed. His left arm was in a makeshift sling, and his face was bruised and cut, but he was alive. And he wasn't alone. Riding beside him was another figure, a woman with a rifle held expertly across her saddle. She had sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense expression. "Sarah Thomas," Jack said as he dismounted, wincing as he put weight on his side. "This is Isabel." Sarah stared, the woman from the locket, Jack's sister. But she wasn't a prisoner. She was a warrior. "Barlow doesn't have her," Jack explained, a grim smile on his face. "She escaped him over a year ago. She's been leading a resistance against him, helping the families he's ruined. I wasn't just hunting Barlow. I was trying to find her." Isabel dismounted, her movements fluid and confident. "My brother has a flair for the dramatic," she said, her voice dry but warm. "He got your message to me a week ago. I've been tracking Croft's men ever since. We saw the fire." She looked at Sarah with respect. "That was a neat trick with the lantern. How did you—" "The gun shot," Sarah stammered. "Shank's a terrible shot," Jack said with a wince. "Just grazed me. I managed to slip away in the chaos, met up with Isabel a few miles out." So he had never been truly alone. He had a plan all along, an army at his back. Sarah felt a new surge of hope. They weren't just three fugitives anymore. They were part of something bigger. "Croft will have sent word to Barlow by now," Isabel said, her expression serious. "They know the map is a fake, and they know you have the real one. They won't just be sending thugs after you now. They'll send everyone." "So we run for Cheyenne?" Sarah asked. Isabel shook her head. "No, that's what they'll expect. We're not going to run." She looked at Jack, a fierce light in her eyes. "We're going to the source. We're going to the southern range. We're going to take back that claim." It was a crazy, audacious plan. To ride straight into the heart of Barlow's territory. But looking at the determined faces of Jack and his sister, Sarah knew it was their only chance. They weren't just going to deliver a map. They were going to start a war. The journey to the southern range was a harsh education in survival. Isabel was their guide, leading them through hidden canyons and forgotten trails that weren't on any map. She taught Sarah how to track, how to read the signs of the land. She taught Thomas how to handle a rifle, not as a toy, but as a tool. The boy soaked it all in, the resentment he'd felt for Jack, transforming into a quiet, fierce admiration. He saw that Jack wasn't just a fighter, he was a leader, deferring to his sister's knowledge of the land, planning their every move with a strategist's mind. During the cold nights, huddled around a smokeless fire, the stories came out. Jack told them about his and Isabel's father, a rancher Barlow had cheated out of his land years ago, starting the feud. He told them how Barlow had murdered his brother, Elias, and then captured Isabel, trying to break her spirit. Isabel told them how she'd escaped, and how she'd spent the last year finding other families ruined by Barlow, building a network, a small army of the dispossessed, all waiting for a chance to fight back. "This isn't just about gold," Isabel explained one night, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "It's about our homes. Barlow has a stranglehold on this whole territory. He controls the water rights, the banks, the law. The gold from that claim is what gives him his power. We take that away, and his whole empire crumbles." Sarah listened, and she understood. This was Daniel's legacy. He wasn't just trying to get rich. He was trying to find a way to break Barlow's grip, to secure a future for his family in a land ruled by a tyrant. The map wasn't just a treasure map. It was the key to liberating the entire region. They finally arrived at the edge of the southern range, a vast, rugged territory of soaring peaks and deep, pine-choked valleys. Isabel pointed to a distant mountain. "That's it," she said. "Barlow's headquarters. The claim is on the other side of that ridge." The place was a fortress. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. A small, crude mining town had sprung up at the base of the mountain, filled with men loyal to Barlow. A frontal assault was impossible, but they didn't need a frontal assault. They had the map. "Barlow has been strip mining the western face for 2 years," Jack explained, looking through a pair of field glasses. but he's barely found anything. He's getting desperate. The main vein, the mother lode Daniel found, isn't there. He tapped the map Thomas held. It's here, in a series of hidden caves on the eastern face, accessible only through an old, forgotten tunnel. Their plan was simple and insane. While Isabel and her small band of fighters created a diversion, drawing Barlow's main force to the western mine, Jack, Sarah, and Thomas would sneak through the old tunnel, get to the main cave, and plant dynamite. They weren't going to just stake a claim. They were going to seal the mine forever, destroying Barlow's source of power in a single decisive blow. "It's too dangerous," Sarah said, her heart pounding at the thought of bringing Thomas into such a place. "He stays with me," Isabel said firmly. "He'll be our lookout. He's got a good eye." She looked at Thomas. "Can you do that, kid? Can you be our eyes?" Thomas stood up straighter, his hand on the rifle she'd given him. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice steady. That night, under the cover of a new moon, the plan went into motion. Isabel and her riders swept down on the mining camp, firing rifles and setting small, controlled fires. Chaos erupted. Men shouted, alarms rang out, and Barlow's main force, just as they'd predicted, rode out to meet the perceived threat. While the battle raged on the far side of the mountain, Jack led Sarah to the hidden entrance of the old tunnel. It was covered by a thicket of overgrown brush, completely invisible to the casual eye. They slipped inside, the air immediately turning cold and damp. They lit a single lantern, the small flame casting huge, dancing shadows on the tunnel walls. The air was thick with the smell of earth and forgotten time. The tunnel twisted and turned, and more than once, they had to crawl through narrow passages. Finally, it opened up into a massive cavern, and there it was. Sarah gasped. The walls of the cave glittered and gleamed in the lantern light. It wasn't just a vein of gold. The entire wall was a solid, shimmering sheet of it. It was a king's ransom, a fortune beyond imagination. Daniel had found it. This was his discovery. "We have to hurry," Jack said, his voice hushed with awe. He opened the satchel he carried and began to place the dynamite charges at key structural points along the wall, his movements quick and expert. As he set the last charge and began to lay the fuse, they heard a noise from the tunnel behind them, scrabbling sounds, and then a voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "I knew you'd come back for it, Vance." A lantern appeared at the far end of the tunnel, and behind it 3 figures emerged. The man in the middle was huge, with a thick beard and cruel piggy eyes. Barlow. On one side of him was Shank, and on the other, his face a mask of terrified sweat, was the banker, Silas Croft. "I must thank you," Barlow boomed, his voice echoing in the cavern. "We've been searching for this entrance for 2 years. You led us right to it." Shank grinned, leveling his rifle at Jack. "Croft here got nervous," Barlow explained. "He remembered some old survey maps from his bank's archives. Mentioned an abandoned tunnel on the eastern face. We were just coming to check it out when we heard your little party." They were trapped. The only way out was the tunnel, and it was blocked. "It's over, Vance," Barlow said, his eyes gleaming with greed as he stared at the wall of gold. "Give me the map, the real one." Jack slowly reached into his shirt, but he didn't pull out the map. He pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden bird. He held it up. "Looking for this?" he asked. Barlow frowned, confused. And in that moment of hesitation, Jack threw it. Not at Barlow, but at the lantern Croft was holding. The lantern shattered, plunging the cave into absolute darkness. Simultaneously, Jack tackled Sarah, pulling her behind a large rock formation. "The fuse!" he yelled. Gunshots erupted in the pitch black, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the chaos. Bullets ricocheted off the cave walls with terrifying whines. Sarah, her heart hammering, fumbled in the dark for the long fuse line. Her fingers found it. Then she searched for the matches Jack had given her. She struck one. The tiny flare of light made her an instant target. A bullet splintered the rock next to her head. The match went out. She tried again. This time, the match caught. In the brief, flickering light, she saw Barlow, his massive form charging toward them. She touched the match to the fuse. It sputtered, then caught, a tiny orange spark racing away into the darkness. "It's lit!" she screamed. "Run!" But there was nowhere to run. Jack shoved her toward a small crevice in the rock wall. "Get in!" he roared. He turned back to face Barlow, who was almost on top of him. In the gloom, she saw the two men collide, a brutal, desperate fight in the dark. She heard the sickening crunch of bone, a grunt of pain. She couldn't see who it was. The fuse was burning faster and faster, a deadly snake slithering toward the dynamite. Outside, Thomas, perched on the ridge above, had seen the second lantern enter the tunnel. He knew something was wrong. Isabel had told him to fire a warning shot if he saw reinforcements. He raised his rifle, took a steadying breath, and fired 2 quick shots into the air. Down at the main camp, Isabel heard the signal. "They're in trouble," she yelled to her men. "Fall back! To the tunnel!" Her fighters broke off their diversionary attack and galloped toward the other side of the mountain. Inside the cave, the fight was savage. Sarah, huddled in the crevice, could only listen to the grunts and curses. She heard Shank yell, then a scream of pain that was cut short. Then she heard Jack's voice, strained. "Sarah! The back of the cave! There's another way out!" The fuse was almost at the end. She could hear it hissing, smell the burning powder. She crawled out of the crevice. The darkness was absolute. "Jack!" she screamed. A hand grabbed her arm. It was Jack. He was limping, breathing heavily. "This way!" He pulled her deeper into the cave. Behind them, they heard Barlow roar in frustration. He had realized what was happening. He was scrambling back toward the main tunnel, trying to escape. They found it at the very back of the cavern, hidden behind a sheet of rock. A narrow fissure, barely wide enough to squeeze through, with a faint draft of cool night air coming from it. Daniel must have used it. "Go!" Jack urged, pushing her through. She scrambled up the narrow passage, rocks cutting into her hands, the hissing of the fuse a frantic countdown in her ears. Jack was right behind her. They burst out onto a small ledge high up on the mountainside, just as a deafening roar shook the very foundations of the earth beneath them. The entire eastern face of the mountain seemed to bulge outward, and then, with a cataclysmic explosion, it collapsed inward, sealing the cave, the gold, and Barlow's greed forever in a tomb of solid rock. They threw themselves flat on the ledge as rocks and debris rained down around them. When the dust settled, there was only silence. They lay there for a long moment, hearts pounding, covered in dust. The entrance to the fissure they'd just escaped was now completely buried under tons of rock. Below them, they could see Isabel and her riders arriving at the now caved-in main entrance to the tunnel. Thomas was with them, having scrambled down the ridge to meet them. They were safe. Jack slowly pushed himself to a sitting position, groaning in pain. In the fight, Barlow had broken 2 of his ribs, but he was smiling. "It's over," he said, his voice raspy. "He's gone." Sarah looked at the mountain, a vast, silent monument to the violence and greed that had haunted her for so long. Daniel was finally avenged. Barlow was entombed with his treasure. Croft and Shank were buried with him. It was a brutal, violent end, but it was an end. She looked at Jack, at this man who had come into her life like a storm and had now led her out of it. "You saved us," she said. "We saved each other," he replied, his pale blue eyes meeting hers in the moonlight. Down below, Thomas saw them on the ledge and let out a whoop of joy. Isabel fired her rifle into the air, a signal of victory. The war was over. The journey back was different. They were no longer fugitives. They were survivors, heroes in a small, private war. Isabel's network of families came out of the woodwork, greeting them not just with relief, but with reverence. With Barlow gone, his empire crumbled overnight. The men who had worked for him scattered, and the land began to breathe again. They returned to the blackened remains of the Caldwell cabin. There was nothing left but a stone chimney stack, standing like a lonely tombstone. Sarah stood before it, Lily holding her hand, and felt not sorrow, but a sense of release. That life, the life of fear and secrets, was over. They would rebuild. Jack, his ribs tightly bandaged, stood beside her. "The map," he said softly. "Thomas still has it." "There's no gold left to claim," she said, looking at the destroyed mountain in the distance. "The gold was never the point," Jack said. He looked at Thomas. "Your father knew that. The map is proof of ownership. With Barlow's organization gone, the territorial government will have to recognize it. They'll have to recognize Daniel's claim." He smiled. "The land is still valuable. Timber, water rights. It's enough. Enough to rebuild this whole valley. Enough for everyone Barlow ever cheated." Weeks turned into months. Spring arrived, and with it, a sense of renewal that was almost palpable. With the legal claims secured by the map, a new town began to grow, built by the families who had been oppressed for so long. They named it Daniel's Hope. Jack and Sarah rebuilt the cabin, not as it was, but bigger, stronger, with wood brought down from the mountains by grateful neighbors. Thomas worked alongside Jack, no longer a boy, but a young man who had seen the worst of the world and had chosen to build something better. Lily planted a garden, her laughter once again a common sound on the homestead. One sunny afternoon, Jack was planting a young oak sapling near the new barn. Sarah came out to watch him, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. "Think it'll take root?" she asked. He looked up at her, his face serious. "I think everything good takes time to take root," he said. He stood up and walked over to her. He didn't have a fancy ring or a prepared speech. He just took her hand. "I spent years hunting a ghost, Sarah. I was running from the past. But here, with you, with the children, I feel like I've finally found a place to run to instead of from." He looked at the new cabin, at the fields, at the children playing near the creek. "Let's build this together," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a promise. Sarah looked at his honest, open face, and for the first time since Daniel's death, she felt the future not as a threat, but as a welcome sunrise. She smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Okay, Jacob Vance," she said, using his real name. "Let's build it together." Their story became a quiet legend in that corner of Wyoming, a story not of gold or revenge, but of how a good family, pushed to the edge, found the strength to fight back and build a new beginning from the ashes. It proves that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't buried under a mountain, but are standing right beside you. If you enjoyed this story of survival and justice, and you want to hear more tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an update.